I have learned that there are moments in life when time itself seems to hold its breath, waiting to see if you will shatter or survive. My wedding night was such a moment, and even now, years later, I can still feel the cold silk of my nightgown against my skin, still hear the soft click of the door as my maid departed and left me alone with a man I barely knew. "You may leave us," I had said to her, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. She curtsied and withdrew, and I watched the candlelight dance across the walls of the bedchamber as though mocking me with its warmth. The Duke of Blackmoor stood near the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the moonlight that poured through the glass like spilled milk. He had not moved since entering the room, had not spoken a single word since the door closed behind us, and I wondered if he could hear my heart pounding from across the vast expanse of Persian carpet that separated us. I should tell you how I came to be standing in that room, trembling like a leaf in autumn, married to a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before a storm. My name is Eleanor Ashworth, or it was before that morning when I became the Duchess of Blackmoor, and my story begins not with love, but with debt, not with hope, but with desperation. My father, Baron Ashworth, had been a kind man once, before the cards and the horses and the whispered promises of fortune consumed him whole. I remember him from my childhood as a gentle figure who would lift me onto his shoulders and carry me through the gardens of our modest estate, pointing out the roses and telling me that I was more beautiful than any flower that ever bloomed. But gambling is a disease that eats a man from the inside, and by the time I turned 20, there was nothing left of my father but hollow eyes and trembling hands and a mountain of debt that threatened to bury us all. It was my mother who first spoke the words that would seal my fate. "We must find you a husband, Eleanor," she had said one evening as we sat in the drawing room, the fire burning low because we could no longer afford enough coal to keep it bright. "A wealthy husband. It is the only way." I had known, of course. I had known for months that this conversation would come, that my youth and my face and whatever grace I possessed would become currency to be traded for our survival. I was not naive enough to believe in love matches, not practical enough to think that a baron's daughter with no dowry and a father drowning in scandal could attract anything but fortune hunters and desperate men. But I had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that I might at least have some say in my own fate. The Duke of Blackmoor was not what I had expected when my mother first mentioned his name. I had heard the rumors, of course. All of London had heard them. They said he was cold as the stones of his northern castle, that his first wife had died under mysterious circumstances, that he had not smiled since the day they lowered her into the ground 5 years prior. They said he was looking for a new duchess, not out of loneliness or desire for companionship, but because he needed an heir and his estates required a mistress. They said many things, and I believed most of them, because it was easier to believe in monsters than to hope for something better. Our first meeting took place in the drawing room of his London townhouse, a cavernous space filled with dark furniture and darker portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch my every move with disapproval. My mother had dressed me in my finest gown, a pale blue silk that had been mended twice at the seams but still maintained enough elegance to pass inspection. She had pinched my cheeks to bring color to them and reminded me no fewer than 7 times to smile and be agreeable, and not to speak unless spoken to first. The Duke entered the room like a shadow taking form, tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a raven's wing and eyes the color of a winter storm. He was handsome in the way that dangerous things are often beautiful, and when his gaze fell upon me, I felt as though he could see through my carefully constructed composure to the frightened girl beneath. "Miss Ashworth," he had said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying the faint trace of the northern accent that marked his origins. "I trust your journey was not too arduous." "Not at all, Your Grace," I had replied, keeping my eyes downcast as propriety demanded. The roads were quite good for this time of year. And so began the most peculiar courtship I could have imagined. The Duke visited our home 3 times over the following fortnight, each visit lasting precisely 1 hour, each conversation following the same pattern of polite inquiries and measured responses. He asked about my education, my accomplishments, my opinions on household management. He did not ask if I could love him, did not inquire about my dreams or my fears, or the secret places in my heart where I kept the things that mattered most. And I, bound by the unspoken rules of our arrangement, did not offer them. On his 4th visit, he proposed, not with flowers or poetry or any of the romantic gestures that young girls dream of, but with a straightforward declaration that felt more like a business arrangement than a marriage offer. "I find you suitable, Miss Ashworth," he had said, standing before the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back. "I am prepared to settle your father's debts and provide for your family in exchange for your hand in marriage. You will want for nothing as my wife. Do you accept?" I had looked at my mother then, seen the desperate hope in her eyes, felt the weight of my father's failures pressing down upon my shoulders like a physical burden. I thought of the servants who would lose their positions if we could not pay them, of the creditors who knocked on our door with increasing frequency, of the whispers that followed us through every ballroom and dinner party. And I thought of myself, of the future that stretched before me like an endless gray road, and I said the only word I could say, yes. The weeks between my acceptance and my wedding passed in a blur of dress fittings and guest lists and lessons in the proper management of a ducal household. I saw the Duke only twice during this time, once at a dinner party where he barely acknowledged my presence beyond a curt nod, and once in the garden of his London home where he walked beside me in silence for 20 minutes before excusing himself to attend to business matters. I told myself that his coldness was simply his nature, that many marriages began without affection and grew into something warmer over time. I told myself that I could learn to be content, if not happy, in my new role. But even as I repeated these reassurances like prayers, I knew that I was lying. Not about the Duke's coldness or my ability to endure it, but about something far more fundamental. There was a reason I flinched when men stood too close, a reason my hands trembled when I was alone with any male who was not my father. There was a darkness in my past that I had buried so deep I sometimes convinced myself it had never happened at all. And as my wedding night approached, that darkness began to claw its way back to the surface. I was 17 when it happened. His name was Lord Pemberton, and he was a friend of my father's, a frequent guest at our dinner table, a man everyone trusted and admired. He found me alone in the library one evening during a house party, and what he did in those terrible minutes between the closing of the door and the sound of footsteps in the hallway that finally drove him away, I could not speak of even now if my life depended upon it. He left me broken on the floor, warned me that no one would believe me if I told, and walked back into the party as though nothing had happened. I never told anyone, not my mother, who would have been destroyed by the knowledge, not my father, who would have challenged Pemberton and likely died for it, leaving us with nothing. I buried the memory beneath layers of silence and shame, convinced myself that I was damaged goods, that no man would ever want me if he knew the truth, that my only hope was to pretend it had never happened and pray that whoever I married would never discover my secret. But standing in that bedchamber on my wedding night, watching the Duke's silhouette against the window, I felt all my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. My hands shook so violently that I clasped them together to still them. My breath came in short, shallow gasps that I struggled to control. And when the Duke finally turned from the window and took a step toward me, I did something I had sworn I would never do. I flinched, visibly, unmistakably, like a wounded animal expecting a blow. He stopped immediately, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could feel tears burning behind my eyes, could feel the shame rising in my throat like bile, and I waited for the questions that would surely follow, the demands for explanation, the anger that I had deceived him by pretending to be something I was not. But the Duke did not ask questions. He did not demand anything. Instead, he simply stood there, studying me with those storm-gray eyes. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "You are afraid," he said. It was not a question. I could not answer. The words lodged in my throat, trapped behind years of silence and shame. He nodded slowly, as though I had confirmed something he already suspected. Then, without another word, he crossed to the armchair beside the fireplace and sat down, his long legs stretched before him, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Go to bed, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I will not touch you tonight." I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. This was not how wedding nights were supposed to unfold. This was not what I had been taught to expect, what I had steeled myself to endure. I had prepared myself for pain, for duty, for the fulfillment of an obligation that I had no choice but to accept. I had not prepared myself for mercy. "Your Grace," I began, but he raised a hand to silence me. "Go to bed," he repeated. "We will speak in the morning." And so I did. I climbed beneath the heavy brocade covers of the massive four-poster bed that dominated the room, and I lay there in the darkness, listening to the crackle of the fire and the sound of my own breathing gradually slowing. The Duke remained in his chair, a silent sentinel watching over me from across the room, and though I told myself I would never be able to sleep with him there, exhaustion and relief eventually pulled me under. When I woke the next morning, he was gone. The chair was empty, the fire had burned down to embers, and pale autumn sunlight streamed through the windows to illuminate a room that felt somehow different in the daylight. On the pillow beside me lay a single white rose, its petals still dewy and fresh, and beneath it a note written in a bold, precise hand. "You have nothing to fear from me. When you are ready to tell me what shadows haunt you, I will listen. Until then, I will wait." I read those words 3 times before I believed they were real. And then, for the first time since Lord Pemberton had destroyed my innocence in that library so many years ago, I allowed myself to cry. The tears came slowly at first, hesitant drops that traced paths down my cheeks and fell onto the silk pillowcase. But once they began, I could not stop them. I wept for the girl I had been before that terrible night, innocent and hopeful, and believing that the world was essentially kind. I wept for the years I had spent pretending, building walls so high around my heart that even I could no longer see over them. I wept for all the things I had never allowed myself to feel, all the grief and rage and desperate longing that I had buried beneath a mask of composure and duty. And somewhere in the midst of that flood of emotion, something shifted inside me. It was small, barely perceptible, like the first crack in ice that has been frozen solid for years. But it was there, a tiny seed of something that might, in time, grow into hope. I did not know yet what kind of man my husband truly was. I did not know if his kindness was genuine or merely a temporary reprieve before he claimed what was rightfully his. I did not know if I would ever be able to tell him the truth about what had happened to me, or if he would still look at me the same way if I did. But for the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that perhaps, against all odds and expectations, I had married a man who might prove to be something other than my destruction. The rose lay beside me on the pillow, its fragrance delicate and sweet, a small beauty in the midst of all my confusion. I reached out and touched its petals with trembling fingers, marveling at their softness, at the care someone must have taken to place it there without waking me. The Duke of Blackmoor, whom all of London believed to be made of stone and shadow, had watched over me through the night and left me a flower in the morning. I pressed the rose to my chest and closed my eyes, letting the last of my tears fall freely. Whatever came next, Whatever challenges and revelations awaited me in this strange new life I had entered, I would face them. I had survived worse. I had survived the unsurvivable and emerged, scarred, but still standing. Perhaps, I thought, as the morning light grew stronger and the sounds of the household stirring began to filter through the walls, perhaps survival was not the ceiling, but merely the floor. Perhaps there was something beyond mere endurance, something that looked like healing, something that felt like being whole again. I did not dare to name it yet, but I held the rose against my heart and let myself imagine, just for a moment, that such a thing might be possible. A soft knock at the door startled me from my reverie. I quickly wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and sat up against the pillows, clutching the bedcovers to my chest as the door opened to reveal a young maid with a kind face and gentle eyes. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy. "I am Sarah, your lady's maid. His Grace has instructed me to attend to you and to inform you that breakfast will be served in the morning room whenever you are ready to come down. Your Grace." The title felt foreign on my ears, like a garment that did not quite fit. I had known, intellectually, that I would become a duchess upon my marriage, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, startlingly real. "Thank you, Sarah." I managed, my voice hoarse from crying. "I will dress shortly." As the maid bustled about the room, laying out my clothes and drawing back the heavy curtains to let in more of the autumn sunlight, I found my thoughts returning again and again to the man who had become my husband. He had seen my fear last night. He had witnessed me flinch from his touch like a frightened animal. And instead of demanding explanations or pressing his marital rights, he had simply waited. He had given me space. He had left me a rose and a promise. What manner of man was the Duke of Blackmoor truly? The question echoed through my mind as I dressed and prepared to face him across the breakfast table. The answer, I sensed, would determine the entire course of my future. And despite all my years of guarding my heart, despite all my certainty that hope was nothing more than a prelude to disappointment, I found myself desperately wanting that answer to be something good. The morning room was bathed in pale golden light when I finally descended the stairs, my heart beating an uncertain rhythm against my ribs. I had taken more care than usual with my appearance, allowing Sarah to arrange my hair in an elegant twist and selecting a morning dress of soft lavender that brought some color to my pale cheeks. I did not know why it mattered to me what the Duke thought of my appearance, only that it did, and that small admission unsettled me more than I cared to acknowledge. He was already seated when I entered, a newspaper spread before him and a cup of tea steaming at his elbow. He rose immediately upon seeing me, a gesture of courtesy that I had not expected, and I noticed for the first time how the morning light softened the harsh planes of his face. He was still formidable, still possessed of that dangerous beauty that had struck me at our first meeting, but there was something different in his eyes today, something watchful and careful, as though he were handling something fragile and did not wish to break it. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said, pulling out the chair beside him rather than the one at the far end of the table where propriety would have placed me. "Did you sleep well?" The question was simple, commonplace, the sort of inquiry any husband might make of his wife on the morning after their wedding. But I heard the deeper question beneath it, the unspoken acknowledgement of what had passed between us in the darkness of our bedchamber, and I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "I did, Your Grace," I replied, settling into the offered chair and accepting the cup of tea that a footman poured for me. "Thank you." He studied me for a moment, his gray eyes unreadable. "You may call me James," he said at last. "We are married now. There is no need for such formality when we are alone." James. I turned the name over in my mind, trying to reconcile it with the imposing figure before me. It seemed too ordinary a name for a man of such presence, too human for someone the world believed to be carved from ice and shadow. And yet, as I looked at him across the breakfast table, I thought perhaps that was the point. Perhaps beneath the title and the reputation and the walls he had built around himself, There was simply a man named James who had his own reasons for keeping the world at bay. "Very well," I said softly. James. Something flickered in his expression, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. He nodded once and returned his attention to his newspaper, but I noticed that his eyes did not move across the page, that he was not truly reading at all. We ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the clink of cutlery against china and the distant murmur of servants going about their duties elsewhere in the house. It should have been awkward, that silence, weighted with all the things that remained unspoken between us. But somehow it was not. There was a quality to it that felt almost companionable, as though we had reached some unspoken agreement to simply exist in each other's presence without demand or expectation. It was James who finally broke the stillness. "I thought you might like to see the house today," he said, setting aside his paper. "Blackmoor Hall is quite large, and I would not want you to lose your way." "I would like that," I replied, surprised by the offer. I had expected to be left to my own devices, to explore my new home alone, while my husband attended to the business matters that seemed to consume so much of his time. The prospect of spending the day in his company was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. We began our tour in the East Wing, where the family apartments were located. James walked beside me through corridors lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, his hand occasionally brushing the small of my back to guide me through doorways or around corners. Each touch sent a small shock through my body, not of fear, but of something else entirely, something I did not have a name for and was not sure I wanted to examine too closely. He told me the history of the house as we walked, stories of the Blackmoor dukes who had come before him, tales of triumphs and tragedies that stretched back generations. His voice was low and measured, but I detected a note of pride beneath the careful neutrality, a genuine love for this ancient pile of stone and timber that had been his family's home for centuries. "My grandfather built this wing," he said, as we entered a long gallery filled with paintings and sculptures. "He was a great patron of the arts. Some of these pieces were commissioned specifically for this space." I wandered along the gallery, marveling at the beauty that surrounded me. There were landscapes and portraits, still lifes and mythological scenes, each one more exquisite than the last. But it was a small painting near the end of the gallery that captured my attention and held it fast. It depicted a young woman seated in a garden, her dark hair loose about her shoulders, her face turned toward the viewer with an expression of such tender joy that my breath caught in my throat. "Who is she?" I asked, unable to look away from those luminous eyes. James came to stand beside me, and when I glanced at him, I saw that his face had gone very still. "That is my mother," he said quietly. "It was painted the year before she died. I was 7 years old." "I am sorry," I whispered, the words inadequate but sincere. "She was beautiful." "She was," he agreed, "and she was kind. Kinder than anyone I have ever known. She used to tell me that the measure of a man is not in his wealth or his title, but in how he treats those who have no power to resist him." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I thought of the night before, of his restraint and his patience, of the rose on my pillow, and the note that promised he would wait. And I understood, perhaps for the first time, that there was far more to the Duke of Blackmoor than the cold exterior he presented to the world. We continued our tour through the West Wing and the public rooms, through the library with its thousands of leather-bound volumes, and the music room with its gleaming pianoforte, through the conservatory filled with exotic plants, and the billiard room that smelled faintly of tobacco and old wood. By the time we reached the gardens, the morning had given way to early afternoon, and my head was spinning with all I had seen and learned. The gardens were magnificent, even in their autumn dormancy. Formal beds of roses, now past their bloom, gave way to winding paths that disappeared into copses of ancient oaks and beeches. A fountain stood at the center of the main parterre, its waters still and silent, waiting for spring to bring it back to life. "This was my mother's favorite place," James said, as we walked along a gravel path bordered by trimmed hedges. "She would spend hours here, tending to her flowers, watching the birds. After she died, my father let it fall into neglect. I had it restored when I inherited the estate." "It is lovely," I said, and meant it. There was a peace here that I had not expected to find, a sense of sanctuary that seemed to exist outside the strictures and expectations of the society that had brought us together. James stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression was serious, his gray eyes searching my face as though looking for something he was not sure he would find. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and intent, "I want you to know that I meant what I wrote this morning. I will not press you for anything you are not ready to give. This marriage was arranged for practical reasons, but that does not mean it must be cold or cruel. I would have us be friends, if nothing else. Can you accept that?" I looked up at him, this man who had every right to demand my obedience and submission, who could have claimed me without regard for my feelings or my fears. The sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair, and I noticed for the first time the fine lines around his eyes, the marks of grief and responsibility that he wore like invisible armor. "I can accept that," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and I am grateful for your patience. More grateful than you can know." He nodded, something like relief softening his features. "Then let us begin again," he said. "Not as Duke and Duchess, not as parties to a contract, but as two people who might, in time, learn to trust one another." He extended his hand to me, a gesture so simple and yet so profound that I felt tears prick at my eyes. I hesitated for only a moment before placing my fingers in his, feeling the warmth of his palm, the gentle pressure of his grip. "I would like that," I said. "James." His smile was small, barely more than a quirk of his lips, but it transformed his face entirely. For just an instant, I caught a glimpse of the boy he must have been before loss and duty hardened him, and something in my chest ached with a longing I could not name. We walked back toward the house in silence, our hands still loosely joined, and I marveled at how much had changed in the space of a single morning. I was still afraid, still uncertain, still haunted by the shadows of my past. But for the first time since I had accepted his proposal, I felt something other than dread when I thought of my future with this man. That evening, we dined together in the smaller of the two dining rooms, seated across from each other at a table that could have accommodated a dozen guests, but held only us. The conversation flowed more easily than I had expected, touching on books and music and travel, discovering shared interests and gentle disagreements that felt more like connection than conflict. When the meal was finished and the servants had cleared the last of the dishes, James rose and offered me his arm. "May I escort you to your chamber?" he asked, and I heard the question beneath the question, the reassurance that he was not asking for more than my company on the walk upstairs. "Yes," I said, slipping my hand into the crook of his elbow. "Thank you." We walked through the quiet corridors of the great house, past flickering candles and sleeping portraits, until we reached the door to my bedchamber. James stopped there, releasing my arm and stepping back to a respectful distance. "Good night, Eleanor," he said softly. "Sleep well." "Good night," I replied, my hand on the door handle. "James," I added, and he paused in his retreat. "Thank you. For today. For all of it." He inclined his head, and in the candlelight I saw something warm and unguarded in his eyes. "There is nothing to thank me for," he said. "I am only doing what any decent man should do." But that was precisely the point, I thought, as I slipped inside my chamber and closed the door behind me. In my experience, decent men were far rarer than the world pretended, and kindness was not the currency most husbands traded in. The Duke of Blackmoor, for all his reputation, was proving to be something unexpected, something I had never allowed myself to hope for. I undressed slowly, my thoughts full of the day's revelations, and climbed into the vast bed that still felt strange and too large for one person. But as I lay there in the darkness, Listening to the old house settle around me, I realized that for the first time since my wedding, I was not dreading what tomorrow might bring. The rose from that morning still sat in a small vase on my bedside table, its petals beginning to curl at the edges, but its fragrance still sweet. I reached out and touched it gently, a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. Perhaps, I thought as sleep began to claim me, perhaps this arranged marriage might become something more than mere survival after all. Perhaps against all odds and expectations, I had stumbled into something that looked almost like the beginning of happiness. The thought should have frightened me. It should have sent me retreating behind my carefully constructed walls, should have reminded me of all the ways that hope had betrayed me in the past. But lying there in the darkness of Blackmoor Hall, with the memory of James's hand warm in mine and his gentle smile etched in my mind, I found that I did not want to retreat. Not anymore. Whatever secrets I still carried, whatever fears still lurked in the shadows of my heart, I was beginning to believe that perhaps I did not have to carry them alone. The days that followed settled into a gentle rhythm, a pattern of small moments that began to weave themselves into something that felt almost like intimacy. James and I took breakfast together each morning, our conversations growing easier with each passing day. He told me about the estate, about the tenants who depended on him, about the responsibilities that came with his title and the weight they sometimes placed upon his shoulders. And I listened, truly listened, discovering in his words a man very different from the cold aristocrat the world believed him to be. In the afternoons, I explored the house and grounds at my leisure, often accompanied by Sarah, who proved to be not only an excellent lady's maid, but also a warm and observant companion. She told me stories of the household, of the servants who had worked here for generations, of the traditions and customs that governed life at Blackmoor Hall. Through her eyes, I began to see my new home not as a gilded prison, but as a living thing, full of history and humanity and hidden kindnesses. One afternoon, nearly a week after my arrival, I discovered a small door at the end of a corridor I had not yet explored. It was unlocked, and curiosity compelled me to push it open and peer inside. Beyond lay a narrow staircase that wound upward into shadow, and though every sensible instinct told me to close the door and walk away, something stronger drew me forward. The stairs led to a tower room, circular and dusty and filled with the most extraordinary collection of objects I had ever seen. There were books stacked in precarious towers, their spines cracked and faded with age. There were paintings leaned against the walls, some finished and some barely sketched. There were instruments of science and astronomy, telescopes and astrolabes and devices whose purposes I could not begin to guess. And in the center of it all, bathed in light from a single high window, stood an easel bearing a half-finished portrait of a woman I recognized immediately. It was the Duchess of Blackmoor, James's first wife. She had been beautiful, I saw, with fair hair and delicate features, and eyes that seemed to hold both laughter and sorrow in equal measure. The portrait was clearly unfinished, the background merely suggested in loose strokes of paint, but her face was rendered with such loving detail that I felt as though I were intruding upon something sacred. I should not be here, I thought, even as my feet carried me closer. I should not see this, but I could not look away. There was something about the painting that called to me, something about the expression in those captured eyes that spoke of secrets and sorrows not unlike my own. Who had she been, this woman who had worn my title before me? What had she known? What had she suffered? What had she loved and lost in her brief time as the Duchess of Blackmoor? I was so lost in contemplation that I did not hear the footsteps on the stairs until James's voice broke the silence behind me. "Eleanor." I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, expecting anger or accusation. But James's face held neither. He stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, his expression more weary than anything else. "I am sorry," I said quickly, the words tumbling over themselves in my haste to explain. "I did not mean to pry. I found the door, and I was curious, and I should not have come up here without asking. I will leave immediately. No. He held up a hand to stop me, then moved into the room with slow, deliberate steps. No, it is all right. I should have shown you this place myself. I simply... He paused, his gaze drifting to the portrait. I was not sure I was ready. He came to stand beside me, and for a long moment we both looked at the unfinished painting in silence. The light from the high window painted shadows across his face, and I saw in his profile the same grief I had glimpsed in the gallery, the same old wound that had never fully healed. Her name was Catherine, he said at last, his voice rough. We were married for 3 years. She died in childbirth along with our son. The words fell between us like stones into still water, rippling outward in waves of sorrow. I wanted to reach for him, to offer some comfort, but I did not know if my touch would be welcome. I am so sorry, I whispered instead. James, I am so very sorry. He nodded, his jaw tight. I painted this, he said, gesturing to the portrait. Or I tried to. I started it the month before she died, meaning to give it to her as a gift. Afterward, I could not bring myself to finish it, but I could not bring myself to destroy it either. So it sits here, unfinished, like everything else in this room, like everything I could not hold on to. His voice broke on the last words, and something in my heart broke with it. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand over his where it rested on the edge of the easel. His skin was warm beneath my fingers, his hand large and strong and trembling almost imperceptibly. He did not pull away. The weeks that followed my discovery of the tower room marked a turning point in my marriage, though I did not fully recognize it at the time. James and I had shared something in that dusty space filled with unfinished dreams, something that went beyond words or explanations. He had shown me his grief, and I had not turned away. In the strange arithmetic of intimacy that counted for more than I could have imagined. We fell into the habit of spending our evenings together in the library, a vast room lined with books from floor to ceiling, warmed by a fire that the servants kept burning from dusk until we retired. James would read or attend to correspondence while I explored the shelves, discovering treasures hidden among the leather-bound volumes. Sometimes we talked, long, meandering conversations about philosophy and history and the nature of happiness. Sometimes we simply sat in companionable silence, each absorbed in our own pursuits but drawing comfort from the other's presence. It was during one of these evenings, perhaps 3 weeks after our wedding, that James first asked me about my life before our marriage. We had been dancing around the subject since my arrival, both of us careful not to probe too deeply into territories that might prove painful. But that night, as the fire crackled and rain lashed against the windows, he set aside his book and looked at me with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see far more than I wished to reveal. "Tell me about your childhood," he said. "Were you happy?" The question caught me off guard, and I felt my carefully constructed defenses rise instinctively. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only genuine curiosity and something that looked almost like concern. And so, haltingly at first, and then with growing ease, I began to speak. I told him about my father, about the man he had been before gambling consumed him, about the laughter and the warmth that had filled our home when I was young. I told him about my mother, about her fierce devotion to propriety and her desperate attempts to maintain appearances even as our world crumbled around us. I told him about the summers I had spent at my grandmother's cottage by the sea, running barefoot through the sand and believing that life would always be as simple and as beautiful as those golden days. I did not tell him about Lord Pemberton. I was not ready for that, might never be ready, and the thought of speaking those words aloud made my throat close and my hands tremble. But I told him enough, shared enough of myself, that when I finally fell silent, I felt lighter somehow, as though I had set down a burden I had not even realized I was carrying. James listened without interruption, his expression attentive and grave. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I had said too much, revealed too much of the poverty and desperation that had driven me to accept his proposal. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice soft. "Thank you for trusting me with that." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The fire had burned low while I talked, and the shadows in the room had grown longer, pressing in around us like curious spirits. James rose and added another log to the flames, then returned to his chair and fixed me with a gaze that was both tender and searching. "I should tell you about Catherine," he said. "About what really happened." "You do not have to," I said quickly, though part of me desperately wanted to know. "It is not my place to ask." "No," he replied, shaking his head. "But it is your right to know. You are my wife now, and the shadows of my past affect you whether we speak of them or not. I would rather you hear the truth from me than piece it together from servants' gossip and society whispers." He settled back in his chair, his eyes distant, fixed on some point beyond the walls of the room. When he began to speak, his voice was low and measured, as though he were reciting a tale he had told himself many times in the darkness of sleepless nights. "I married Catherine when I was 25, he said. "She was the daughter of an earl, beautiful and accomplished, and everything my family could have wished for in a duchess. We were not a love match, not at first. Our marriage was arranged much as ours was, a union of convenience and social expectation. But over time, I came to care for her deeply, and she, I believe, came to care for me." He paused, his jaw tightening with the effort of continuing. "When she told me she was with child, I thought our happiness was complete. I had everything I had ever wanted, everything I had been taught to value. A wife who understood me, an heir on the way, a future that seemed bright and certain." "What happened?" I asked softly, though I already knew the answer, had known it since I saw the unfinished portrait in the tower room. "The birth was difficult," James said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The physicians did everything they could, but the child was positioned wrong, and Catherine was not strong enough to endure what followed. She labored for nearly 2 days before the end. Our son was born dead, and Catherine followed him less than an hour later. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath. Tears pricked at my eyes, and I did not try to stop them from falling. The image he painted was too vivid, too terrible, and I could only imagine the weight of such a loss, the devastation of watching everything you loved slip away in the space of a single night. "James," I breathed, his name a prayer and a lament. "I am so sorry." He looked at me then, and I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears of his own. "For a long time," he said, "I blamed myself. I thought that if I had loved her more, protected her better, somehow prevented the pregnancy that killed her, she might still be alive. I withdrew from the world, from everyone who tried to reach me. I became the cold, unfeeling Duke that society whispers about, because it was easier to feel nothing than to feel the magnitude of what I had lost." He rose from his chair and crossed to the window, his back to me, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the rain-streaked glass. "And then you came," he continued, his voice rough. "A woman I barely knew, contracted to become my wife for reasons that had nothing to do with love or even affection. I expected to feel nothing for you, expected our marriage to be a matter of duty and convenience, and nothing more." He turned to face me, and the vulnerability in his expression stole my breath. "But you surprised me, Eleanor. From the first night, when you stood trembling in our bedchamber with such fear in your eyes, you surprised me. I looked at you, and I saw not a stranger to be tolerated, but a person who had known suffering, who carried wounds as deep as my own, and something in me recognized something in you." I rose from my seat, drawn toward him by a force I could not name or resist. We stood facing each other in the firelight, the distance between us measured in heartbeats and held breath. "I have not allowed myself to feel anything for 5 years, James said, his voice breaking on the words. I did not think I was capable of it anymore. But you have made me feel again, Eleanor. And I do not know whether to thank you for it or to be terrified. I reached up and touched his face, my fingers trembling against the rough stubble of his jaw. He closed his eyes at the contact, and I felt him lean into my palm like a man starving for warmth. I am terrified too, I whispered. I have been terrified for so long that I had forgotten what it felt like to be anything else. But I am beginning to think that perhaps terror and hope are not so different after all. Perhaps they are both just different faces of the same willingness to care about something enough that losing it would break you. He opened his eyes and looked down at me, and in his gaze I saw everything he could not yet say aloud. The longing and the fear, the grief and the fragile new growth that was pushing up through the ashes of his shattered heart. I saw myself reflected there, saw my own journey mirrored in his, and I understood that whatever happened next, we were no longer strangers navigating an arranged marriage. We were two broken people who had somehow found each other in the darkness, and together we were learning what it meant to hope again. James raised his hand and covered mine where it rested against his cheek. His fingers were warm, his touch gentle, as though he were handling something precious and easily shattered. "I want to kiss you," he said, his voice a low rumble that I felt as much as heard. "But only if you want it too. Only if you are not afraid." I should have been afraid. Every lesson my body had learned in the aftermath of Lord Pemberton's assault told me to pull away, to retreat behind my walls, to protect myself from the vulnerability that intimacy demanded. But standing there in the firelit library, looking up at the man who had shown me nothing but patience and kindness since the moment I became his wife, I found that I was not afraid. Not of him. Not anymore. "I want it," I whispered. "I want you to kiss me." He leaned down slowly, giving me every opportunity to change my mind, to pull away if the closeness became too much. But I did not pull away. I rose up on my toes to meet him, and when his lips finally touched mine, the gentleness of it undid me completely. It was not the kiss of a man claiming what was owed to him. It was not demanding or possessive or rough. It was tender, questioning, reverent, as though I were something sacred that he did not dare to profane. His hands came up to cup my face, his thumbs brushing away the tears I had not realized were falling, and I melted into him like snow meeting spring. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, both trembling with the weight of what had passed between us. James rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breath warm against my lips. "Thank you," he murmured, "for trusting me, for letting me in." I smiled, a real smile, perhaps the first genuine smile I had worn since before my world fell apart. "Thank you," I replied, "for waiting, for being patient, for seeing me as something more than a means to an end." He pulled back and looked at me, his expression fierce with an emotion I was only beginning to recognize. "You are so much more than that," he said. "You are so much more than you know." We stood there in the library until the fire burned down to embers and the rain outside faded to a soft drizzle. We did not speak again, did not need to. The silence between us had transformed into something warm and full, a shared space that held all the words we were not yet ready to say aloud. When at last we parted for the night, James walked me to my chamber door as he always did. But this time, before he withdrew, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my knuckles that lingered long after he had gone. I lay awake for hours that night, my heart too full for sleep. Something had shifted between us. Some wall had fallen that could never be rebuilt. I was still afraid, still haunted by secrets I had not yet found the courage to share. But for the first time in years, the fear was not the loudest voice in my head. Hope was beginning to whisper, and I was finally learning to listen. The morning after our first kiss dawned bright and cold, the autumn rain giving way to pale sunshine that poured through my windows like liquid gold. I woke with a strange lightness in my chest, a sense of possibility that I had not felt in years. The memories of the previous night played through my mind like scenes from a dream I did not want to end. Sarah arrived to help me dress, and if she noticed the flush in my cheeks or the secret smile that kept tugging at my lips, she was too discreet to comment. I chose a gown of deep emerald green, one of the new dresses that had been made for me as part of my trousseau, and allowed her to arrange my hair in a more elaborate style than I usually wore. I wanted to look beautiful. I wanted James to see me and know that something between us had changed. He was waiting for me in the breakfast room, and when I entered, he rose from his chair with an alacrity that made my heart skip. His eyes swept over me, taking in the new dress and the careful arrangement of my hair, and a slow smile spread across his face that transformed him from the stern Duke into something far more approachable. "You look lovely," he said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "Green suits you." "Thank you," I replied, feeling heat rise to my cheeks. I thought it was time I began to dress as befits my station. He pulled out my chair for me, letting his fingers brush against my shoulder as I sat down, and the casual intimacy of the gesture sent a pleasant shiver down my spine. We ate breakfast together as we always did, but everything felt different now. The conversation flowed more easily, punctuated by small smiles and lingering glances that spoke of the new understanding between us. "I thought we might take a drive today," James said as the servants cleared the dishes. "The weather is fine, and there is a village nearby that I would like to show you. The tenants have been asking about the new Duchess, and it would be good for them to meet you. The prospect of meeting the people who depended on my husband, of taking my place as the mistress of Blackmoor in truth rather than merely in name, filled me with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. But with James beside me, I felt ready to face whatever challenges the day might bring. "I would like that very much," I said. "Give me a moment to fetch my cloak." The village of Blackmoor was smaller than I had expected, a cluster of stone cottages and shops nestled in a valley a few miles from the great house. As our carriage rolled through the main street, people emerged from doorways and paused in their work to watch us pass. Their faces were curious, but not unfriendly, and when James raised his hand in greeting, they smiled and waved in return. He was different here, I noticed. The formal reserve that he wore like armor in London society seemed to fall away in the presence of these people who had known him all his life. He stopped to speak with the blacksmith about a horse that needed shoeing, listened patiently as an elderly widow described her rheumatism, praised a young boy who was learning his letters at the village school. And everywhere we went, he introduced me with quiet pride, as though presenting a treasure he had been fortunate to find. The tenants were welcoming and warm, pressing my hands between their work-roughened palms and telling me how pleased they were that the master had finally found happiness again. Several of the older women made veiled references to Catherine, speaking of her kindness and her charity work among the poor, and I understood that I was being measured against a memory that still loomed large in their hearts. Rather than resenting the comparison, I found myself wanting to honor it. Catherine had been beloved here, had used her position to do genuine good in the lives of those less fortunate. If I was to take her place, I wanted to prove myself worthy of the title I had inherited. On the drive back to the house, I turned to James with a request that had been forming in my mind throughout our visit. "I would like to continue the work that Catherine began," I said. "The visits to the sick, the charity baskets, the school. I would like to be useful, to contribute something meaningful to this community that has become my home." James looked at me with an expression I could not quite read, something between surprise and profound emotion. He reached across the carriage and took my hand in his grip warm and steady. "That would mean a great deal," he said quietly, "to the tenants and to me. Catherine would have wanted her work to continue." "Then I will see that it does," I promised. This is my home now, and these are my people. I want to care for them as you do." He raised my hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to my fingers. And in that simple gesture, I felt the foundation of our marriage shift and strengthen. We were building something real here, something that went beyond the contract that had brought us together. We were becoming partners in the truest sense of the word. That night at dinner, James presented me with a gift, a small leather box that contained the keys to every room in Blackmoor Hall. They had belonged to Catherine, he explained, and before her to his mother, and before her to generations of duchesses stretching back centuries. "These are yours now," he said, placing the box in my hands. "This house is yours. Everything in it is yours. I want you to feel that you belong here, Eleanor, because you do. You are exactly where you are meant to be." I held the keys against my chest, feeling the weight of history and responsibility they represented. And I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that somewhere in the past few weeks I had stopped thinking of Blackmoor as a prison and begun thinking of it as home. The darkness of my past still lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a shadow that I knew I would eventually have to face and dispel. But for now, wrapped in the warmth of my husband's regard and the growing certainty that I had found a place where I truly belonged, I allowed myself to believe that happiness might not be beyond my reach after all. The night was cold, the first true frost of autumn settling over the grounds like a silver blanket. But inside the walls of Blackmoor Hall, I had never felt so warm. I should have known that happiness, like all precious things, invites the attention of those who would destroy it. For nearly 2 months I had lived in a dream, wrapped in the growing warmth of my marriage and the slow unfurling of something that felt dangerously like love. James and I had become true companions, spending our days in shared pursuits and our evenings in conversations that ranged from the profound to the playful. He had not pressed me for more than I was ready to give, content with the kisses we exchanged in quiet moments and the increasing ease with which I allowed him to hold me. And I, foolish creature that I was, had begun to believe that my past could remain buried forever. The letter arrived on a gray December morning, delivered by a footman who had no way of knowing that the elegant cream envelope he carried would shatter the fragile peace I had built. I was in the morning room, reviewing the household accounts that had become part of my daily responsibilities, when he placed it on the silver tray beside me and withdrew with a bow. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar, but the return address made my blood turn to ice. Lord Geoffrey Pemberton, Pemberton House, London. For a long moment, I could not move, could not breathe, could only stare at those hateful words as though they were a serpent coiled upon my desk. My hands trembled as I reached for the letter, and it took 3 attempts before I could break the seal and unfold the paper within. "My dearest Eleanor," the letter began, and I nearly retched at the presumption of that greeting. "I was so pleased to learn of your marriage to the Duke of Blackmoor. Please accept my belated congratulations on your elevation to such an exalted station. I confess I have thought of you often since our last encounter, and I find myself curious to see what manner of woman you have become. I shall be in the North Country next month, visiting friends, and I intend to call upon you and your husband. I do hope you will receive me with the warmth that our long acquaintance deserves. Until then, I remain your devoted servant, Lord Pemberton." The letter fell from my nerveless fingers and drifted to the floor. I sat frozen in my chair, my mind racing through possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. He knew where I was. He was coming here, to my home, to the sanctuary I had built with James. He would stand in my drawing room and smile at me with those cold eyes, and every moment of our encounter would be a reminder of what he had done, what he had taken, what he could still destroy if he chose to speak. I do not know how long I sat there before the paralysis broke and panic took its place. I snatched the letter from the floor and crumpled it in my fist, my first instinct to burn it, to destroy every trace of its existence. But even as I rose to throw it in the fire, I realized that destroying the letter would not destroy the threat it represented. Pemberton was coming. Whether I burned his words or not, that terrible fact remained. What was I to do? I could not tell James, could not bear to see the way he would look at me when he learned the truth. He thought me merely shy, merely wounded by some unspecified trauma that I was not ready to discuss. If he knew what had actually happened, if he understood that I had been ruined by another man before I ever came to him, he would be disgusted. He would regret our marriage, regret every kindness he had shown me, regret every moment of the intimacy we had built together. I would lose him, and losing him now, when I had only just begun to understand how much he meant to me, would destroy me completely. But I could not face Pemberton alone. The thought of standing in a room with him, of making polite conversation while he smirked at me with the knowledge of my shame, made me physically ill. I pressed my hand to my mouth and swallowed hard against the nausea that rose in my throat. Eleanor. James's voice from the doorway made me jump so violently that I knocked over the inkwell on my desk. Black liquid pooled across the polished wood, dripping onto the carpet below, but I could not move to stop it. I could only stand there, the crumpled letter clutched in my fist, staring at my husband with wide, terrified eyes. What is wrong? He crossed the room in 3 quick strides, his expression shifting from concern to alarm as he took in my pallor and my trembling hands. You look as though you have seen a ghost. I shook my head, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stand there and feel my carefully constructed world crumbling around me. James reached for the letter in my hand, and I flinched away from him with a violence that shocked us both. He went very still. Eleanor, he said quietly, his voice careful and controlled in a way that told me he was working hard to keep his own fear in check. Whatever this is, whatever has frightened you so badly, you can tell me. I am your husband. There is nothing you could say that would change that. The kindness in his words broke something inside me. I had spent so long protecting myself, so long hiding behind walls of silence and shame, that I had forgotten what it felt like to have someone offer to share my burden. Tears began to stream down my face, and I found that I could not stop them. I cannot, I whispered. James, please, I cannot tell you. You will hate me. He stepped closer, slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. I could never hate you, he said. Do you not know that by now? Whatever darkness you carry, I would rather share it with you than watch you bear it alone. He reached for my hand again, and this time I did not pull away. His fingers closed around the crumpled letter, gently extracting it from my grip, and I watched in helpless horror as he smoothed out the paper and began to read. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I watched James's face as his eyes moved across Pemberton's words, watched the confusion give way to understanding, and then to something darker, something that looked almost like rage. When he finally looked up at me, his gray eyes were blazing with an emotion I had never seen in him before. Who is this man to you? He asked, his voice dangerously soft. What does he mean by your last encounter? The moment I had dreaded for years had finally arrived. I could lie, could invent some innocent explanation for Pemberton's letter, and pray that James believed me. But looking into my husband's eyes, seeing the trust that still lingered there despite his obvious suspicion, I found that I could not bring myself to deceive him. He deserved better than that. He deserved the truth, no matter how much it cost me to speak it. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs no longer able to support me. And then, in a voice that shook with shame and fear and the release of years of buried pain, I told him everything. I told him about the library at Lord Harrington's house party, about the evening I had wandered away from the other guests seeking a few moments of quiet. I told him about the sound of the door closing, about turning to find Pemberton standing there with a smile that made my blood run cold. I told him about the words he had said, the threats he had made, the way he had used my youth and my isolation and my family's precarious position to ensure my silence. I told him what he had done to me, The details I had never spoken aloud to anyone, the memories that still haunted my nightmares and made me flinch from the touch of men I did not trust. And when I finished, when the last terrible word had fallen from my lips, and I sat there exposed and trembling, I waited for the disgust I was certain would come. But James did not look disgusted. He looked devastated. He knelt before my chair and took both my hands in his, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with barely contained emotion. "Eleanor," he said, my name a broken sound on his lips. "My God, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that happened to you." I stared at him, unable to process his reaction. "You do not hate me?" I whispered. "You do not think me ruined, damaged, unworthy of being your wife?" "Hate you?" He looked at me as though I had spoken in a language he did not understand. "How could I hate you for being the victim of a monster? You did nothing wrong. You were a child, alone and frightened, and a man you trusted violated that trust in the worst way imaginable. The shame belongs to him, not to you. It has always belonged to him." The tears came harder then, sobs that racked my entire body as years of suppressed grief and shame came flooding out. James gathered me into his arms and held me against his chest, one hand stroking my hair while the other pressed me close, anchoring me to him as though he could protect me from the memories themselves. "I have got you," he murmured against my hair. "You are safe now. I will never let anyone hurt you again." We stayed like that for a long time, until my sobs subsided and my breathing steadied. When I finally lifted my head from his shoulder, I saw that his face was wet with tears of his own. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "He is coming here, James. He is coming to our home, and I do not know how to face him." James's expression hardened into something fierce and protective. "You will not have to face him," he said. "I will handle Lord Pemberton myself." "What do you mean?" He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the last of my tears. "I mean that when that man arrives at Blackmoor, he will be met not by the frightened girl he once terrorized, but by the Duke of Blackmoor and the full weight of my title and my resources. I mean that I will make certain he understands, in terms he cannot possibly misinterpret, that if he ever comes near you again, if he ever speaks your name, or so much as looks in your direction, I will destroy him, utterly and completely." The cold fury in his voice should have frightened me, but instead it made me feel safe in a way I had not felt since before that terrible night in the library. For the first time in years, I was not alone with my secret. For the first time, I had someone willing to fight for me. "You would do that?" I asked. "You would make an enemy of a powerful man for my sake?" James leaned forward and pressed his forehead to mine, his breath warm against my lips. "I would burn down the world for your sake," he said quietly. "Do you not understand yet, Eleanor? I love you. I have loved you for weeks now, though I have been too much of a coward to say it. You are my wife, my partner, my heart, and no one will ever harm you again while I have breath in my body." The words washed over me like warm rain after a long drought. "I love you." 3 simple words that I had never expected to hear, that I had never believed I deserved. And yet here was this man, this proud and wounded duke who had every reason to turn away from me, declaring his love with a fierceness that left no room for doubt. "I love you too," I whispered, the confession feeling like both a surrender and a triumph. "I think I have loved you since the night you left me a rose and a promise." He kissed me then, deeply and thoroughly, with none of the gentle restraint he had shown before. This was a claiming, a declaration, a promise sealed in flesh and breath. And when we finally broke apart, I knew that whatever came next, whatever confrontation awaited us when Pemberton arrived, we would face it together. The shadow of my past had finally stepped into the light, and in that light, with James beside me, it did not seem nearly so terrifying as it once had. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of dread and unexpected peace. James insisted that I not spend a single moment alone worrying about Pemberton's impending visit. He arranged for us to take long walks through the winter gardens, bundled in heavy cloaks against the cold, our breath forming clouds in the frigid air as we talked about everything and nothing. He read to me in the evenings, his deep voice making even the driest history texts come alive. And every night, he held me in his arms until I fell asleep, a silent guardian against the nightmares that had plagued me for years. For the first time since that terrible night in the library, I began to feel the chains of shame loosening their grip. James's unwavering acceptance, his refusal to see me as anything other than a survivor rather than a victim, worked a kind of alchemy on my wounded soul. I was not ruined. I was not damaged beyond repair. I was a woman who had endured something terrible and emerged stronger for it, and I was loved by a man who saw my scars as proof of my courage rather than marks of my shame. We spoke often of what would happen when Pemberton arrived. James had already set his plans in motion, writing letters to solicitors and gathering evidence of the man's character from sources I did not dare to ask about. He assured me that by the time Pemberton set foot on Blackmoor land, James would have enough information to destroy him several times over. "You must understand," James explained one evening as we sat together in the library, "that men like Pemberton do not stop at a single victim. He has done this before, and he will do it again unless someone stops him. I intend to be that someone." The thought that there might be other women out there, other girls who had suffered as I had at Pemberton's hands, filled me with a righteous anger that burned away the last vestiges of my fear. If confronting him meant protecting others from his predation, then I would find the strength to face him. I would stand beside my husband and watch as the monster who had haunted my nightmares was brought to justice. Christmas came and went, a quiet celebration marked by small gifts and quiet moments of joy. James gave me a strand of pearls that had belonged to his mother, clasping them around my neck with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. I gave him a first edition of a book we had discussed during one of our long evenings together, and the delight on his face when he opened it made me feel richer than all the jewels in England could have. On Christmas night, as we sat together before the fire in our private sitting room, James took my hand and looked at me with an expression of profound tenderness. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that whatever happens with Pemberton, whatever the future holds, I am grateful for every moment we have had together. You have given me back something I thought I had lost forever. You have taught me how to hope again." I squeezed his hand, my heart so full that words seemed inadequate. "And you have taught me that I am worthy of love," I replied. "You have shown me that the darkest chapters of our stories do not have to define us. I will never be able to thank you enough for that." He leaned forward and kissed me softly, a tender benediction that spoke of all the things words could not express. And I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, that whatever challenges awaited us, we would face them together. The letter announcing Pemberton's arrival came on the 2nd day of January. He would be at Blackmoor within the week, the message said, and he looked forward to renewing his acquaintance with my charming wife. I read those words and felt only cold determination. The frightened girl who had cowered at the very thought of this man was gone. In her place stood the Duchess of Blackmoor, a woman who had faced her demons and found that they were not nearly so powerful as she had believed. "Let him come," I said to James, my voice steady. "I am ready." And I was. For the first time in years, I was truly ready to face my past and reclaim my future. Whatever happened next, I would no longer be defined by what had been done to me. I would be defined by who I chose to become. The winter sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and I stood at the window of Blackmoor Hall with my husband's hand warm in mine, watching the shadows lengthen across the snow-covered grounds. Tomorrow, the battle would begin. But tonight, I was home. I was loved, and I was finally, blessedly, free. The day Lord Pemberton arrived at Blackmoor Hall, the sky hung low and gray, heavy with the promise of snow. I watched his carriage approach from the window of the drawing room, my hands steady despite the pounding of my heart. James stood beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body, a silent reminder that I was not alone. "Remember," he said quietly, "you do not have to see him at all if you do not wish it. I can handle this matter entirely without your presence." I shook my head, my jaw set with determination. No, I need to face him. I need him to see that I am not the frightened child he remembers. I need to take back what he stole from me. James nodded, respect evident in his gaze. Then we faced him together. The footman announced Lord Pemberton's arrival, and I turned from the window to watch as the man who had haunted my nightmares for years walked into my home. He was older than I remembered, his fair hair threaded with gray, and his face marked by the passage of time. But his eyes were the same, cold and calculating, sweeping the room with the practiced ease of a predator assessing his territory. When his gaze landed on me, something flickered in those pale depths. Recognition, certainly, but also surprise. He had expected to find a victim, a woman cowed by shame and fear. Instead, he found the Duchess of Blackmoor standing tall and composed, her husband at her side, and the full weight of her position wrapped around her like armor. "Lady Blackmoor," he said, executing a bow that dripped with false courtesy. "How delightful to see you again. Marriage clearly agrees with you." Lord Pemberton. I did not curtsy, did not offer him any of the social niceties that our relative positions would normally demand. I remained standing exactly where I was, my chin lifted, my eyes meeting his without flinching. "I cannot say that I share your pleasure at this reunion." His smile faltered, just for an instant, before he recovered his composure. "Come now, surely you cannot still be angry about our little misunderstanding all those years ago. We were both young and foolish. I had hoped that time might have softened your feelings toward me." The audacity of his words, the casual dismissal of what he had done to me as a misunderstanding, should have filled me with rage. But instead, I felt only a cold, clear calm. He was trying to diminish me, to make me doubt my own memories and my right to condemn him. But I was no longer the girl he had broken in that library. I was a woman who had faced her demons and found them wanting. "There was no misunderstanding," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "You know exactly what you did. And so does my husband." Pemberton's gaze shifted to James, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty cross his features. The Duke of Blackmoor stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression one of barely contained fury. He looked every inch the powerful nobleman, and beside him, Pemberton seemed to shrink. "Lord Pemberton," James said, his voice deceptively soft, "I believe we have matters to discuss. Shall we retire to my study?" He did not wait for an answer, simply turned and walked toward the door, clearly expecting Pemberton to follow. After a moment's hesitation, the other man did, casting a backward glance at me that held equal parts confusion and resentment. I remained where I was, watching them go, my heart beating a rapid tattoo against my ribs. The next hour was the longest of my life. I paced the drawing room, unable to sit, unable to focus on anything but the muffled sounds of voices that occasionally reached me from across the hall. I did not know what James was saying to Pemberton, what evidence he was presenting, what threats he was making. I only knew that my entire future hung in the balance of that conversation. When the study door finally opened and James emerged alone, his expression was grim but satisfied. I rushed to meet him, searching his face for any indication of what had transpired. "It is done," he said, taking my hands in his. "He will never trouble you again." "What did you say to him? What did you do?" James led me to a settee and sat beside me, still holding my hands as though he could not bear to let me go. I told him that I have documented evidence of 3 other women he has assaulted over the past decade. I told him that if he ever attempts to contact you again, if he ever speaks your name or comes within 100 miles of Blackmoor, I will ensure that evidence reaches every newspaper in London and every magistrate in England. His reputation, his position, his fortune, everything he values will be destroyed. I stared at him, scarcely able to believe what I was hearing. 3 other women? James nodded, his jaw tight. My solicitors have been thorough. It seems Pemberton has made a habit of preying upon young women in vulnerable positions. None of them came forward because they feared, as you did, that they would not be believed. But together, their testimonies create a pattern that even the most sympathetic court could not ignore. Tears sprang to my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of relief, of vindication, of something that felt almost like triumph. For years I had carried my secret alone, believing myself to be the only one, believing that speaking out would bring nothing but shame and disbelief. But I was not alone. There were others who had suffered as I had, and because of James, because of his determination to protect me, their stories would finally be heard if Pemberton ever dared to strike again. He agreed to your terms? I asked, hardly daring to hope. He had no choice. James's smile was cold and sharp, the smile of a man who had vanquished an enemy. He knows that I am not bluffing. He knows that I have the power and the will to destroy him completely. He will slink back to whatever hole he crawled out of and pray that I never have reason to follow through on my threats. I threw my arms around my husband's neck, holding him tightly as the tears I had been fighting finally spilled over. Thank you, I whispered against his shoulder. Thank you for believing me. Thank you for fighting for me. Thank you for everything. He held me just as tightly, his face buried in my hair. There is nothing to thank me for, he murmured. You are my wife. Protecting you is not a duty or an obligation. It is a privilege and a joy. We stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms as the tension of the past weeks slowly drained away. When we finally drew apart, the gray clouds outside had begun to release their burden, and soft white snowflakes were drifting past the windows like a benediction. The months that followed were the happiest of my life. With the shadow of Pemberton finally lifted, I found myself able to embrace my new existence with a wholeness I had never thought possible. I threw myself into my duties as Duchess, continuing and expanding the charitable works that Catherine had begun, becoming a beloved figure among the tenants and villagers who depended on the Blackmoor estate. And my marriage, which had begun as a cold arrangement between strangers, blossomed into something rare and precious. James and I grew closer with each passing day, our love deepening into a bond that felt unshakable. We talked and laughed and argued and made up. We explored the vast grounds of our estate and traveled to London for the season. We built a life together, brick by careful brick, until what we had constructed was stronger than either of us had dared to imagine. It was on a warm spring evening, nearly a year after our wedding, that I finally found the courage to tell James the last secret I had been keeping. We were walking through the gardens, the roses just beginning to bloom, the air sweet with the scent of new life, when I stopped beneath the old oak tree where we had shared our first kiss. James, I said, my voice trembling slightly with emotion, I have something to tell you. He turned to me, concern flickering in his gray eyes. What is it, my love? Is something wrong? I took his hands in mine and placed them gently on my stomach. Nothing is wrong, I said, a smile spreading across my face despite my attempts to contain it. Everything is wonderfully, perfectly right. James, I am with child. The transformation that came over his face was something I will treasure until my dying day. Shock gave way to wonder, wonder to joy, joy to a love so profound that it seemed to illuminate him from within. He dropped to his knees before me, pressing his forehead to my stomach, his shoulders shaking with emotion. Eleanor, he breathed. My darling Eleanor. Are you certain? I ran my fingers through his dark hair, tears of happiness streaming down my cheeks. The physician confirmed it this morning. We are going to have a baby, James. We are going to be a family. He rose and gathered me into his arms, holding me as though I were the most precious thing in the world. And in that moment, surrounded by blooming roses and the golden light of a perfect spring sunset, I understood that I had found something I had never dared to believe existed. I had found a love that had looked upon my darkest moments and had not turned away. I had found a partner who saw my wounds as proof of my strength rather than evidence of my weakness. I had found a home where I belonged completely, where I was valued and cherished and protected. The girl who had stood trembling in a bedchamber on her wedding night, terrified of what her future might hold, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced her fears and emerged victorious. A woman who had learned that the greatest courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to love despite it. James pulled back and looked at me, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I love you, he said, the words carrying the weight of everything we had been through together. I love you more than I ever thought it possible to love anyone. I reached up and touched his face, tracing the familiar lines and planes that had become dearer to me than my own reflection. And I love you, I replied. I love the man you are and the man you have helped me become. I love our life and our home and the future we are building together. I love everything about this improbable, impossible, absolutely perfect love story we have written together. He kissed me then, deeply and thoroughly, with all the passion and tenderness that had grown between us over the past year. And as the sun set behind the hills and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms might come, we would face them together. I had walked into my marriage expecting nothing but duty and endurance. I had found instead a love story for the ages, written in tears and laughter, in fear and courage, in the quiet moments and the dramatic revelations. I had found a man worth trusting with my darkest secrets and my brightest hopes. And as James took my hand and led me back toward the golden lights of Blackmoor Hall, our home and our sanctuary, I understood at last that the story of my life was not defined by the terrible things that had been done to me. It was defined by the love I had found, the courage I had discovered, and the family I was about to create. The frightened girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the coldest hearts can warm, and that love, true love, is always worth the risk. This was my story, and it was only just beginning. The seasons turned as seasons do, and with each passing month, my body swelled with the new life growing within me. James became the most attentive husband imaginable, refusing to let me lift anything heavier than a teacup, insisting that I rest whenever I showed the slightest sign of fatigue. His protectiveness might have been stifling had it not been so clearly born of love and the lingering shadow of his first wife's death. I understood his fear. Catherine had died in childbirth, and that tragedy haunted him still. But I was determined that history would not repeat itself. I followed the physician's instructions to the letter, ate well, rested often, and refused to give in to the anxiety that sometimes crept into my thoughts in the quiet hours of the night. As my time drew near, James grew more nervous, pacing the halls of Blackmoor like a caged lion, unable to concentrate on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. I found his worry endearing, a testament to how much he cared, and I did my best to reassure him that all would be well. The baby came on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after my wedding night. The labor was long and difficult, just as Catherine's had been, and there were moments when I saw the terror in James's eyes and feared that his worst nightmares were about to come true. But I was strong, stronger than I had ever known myself to be, and when the first cries of our daughter filled the room, I wept with joy and relief, and a love so overwhelming it seemed impossible that my heart could contain it. James held our daughter for the first time with hands that trembled visibly, his face a study in wonder and awe. She was perfect, a tiny miracle with her father's dark hair and her mother's eyes, and when she wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb, I saw him fall completely and irrevocably in love. "What shall we call her?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. I thought for a moment, looking at the precious bundle in his arms, at the man who had given me back my life and my hope and my future. "Rose," I said at last, "for the flower you left on my pillow the morning after our wedding, for the promise you made and kept, for the love that grew from the most unlikely of beginnings." "Rose," he repeated, testing the name on his lips. A slow smile spread across his face. "It is perfect. She is perfect. You are perfect." He leaned down and kissed me, gentle and reverent, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever storms might come, we would weather them together. We were a family now, bound by love and loss and the courage to begin again. In the years that followed, Rose grew into a bright and spirited child, the light of our lives and the heir to everything we had built together. She had her father's intelligence and her mother's resilience, and watching her run through the gardens of Blackmoor, her laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls, I often found myself marveling at the unexpected turns my life had taken. I had come to this place expecting nothing but duty and endurance. I had found instead a love that had transformed me, a family that completed me, and a purpose that gave meaning to every day. The wounds of my past had not disappeared entirely. There were still moments when shadows crossed my mind, when memories surfaced unbidden and reminded me of all I had suffered. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, and when they came, I had James to hold me and remind me that I was safe, that I was loved, that the darkness had no power over me anymore. Lord Pemberton, I learned through society gossip, had retreated entirely from public life. Rumors circulated about scandals and improprieties, whispers that followed him wherever he went. He never married, never achieved the social prominence he had once coveted, and eventually faded into obscurity. I did not know if the other women he had hurt ever found justice or healing, but I hoped with all my heart that they had. I hoped that somewhere, somehow, they too had found the courage to reclaim their lives. On the 5th anniversary of our wedding, James surprised me with a gift that took my breath away. He led me to the tower room, the dusty sanctuary where Catherine's unfinished portrait still stood on its easel, and showed me what he had done. The painting was complete now, finished with loving care and exquisite detail, but beside it, on a second easel, stood another portrait. It was me, captured in oils and light, wearing the green dress I had worn on that first morning after our wedding night, a white rose in my hands and a look of quiet strength in my eyes. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "I wanted you to have a place here too," James said softly, coming to stand beside me. "Not to replace Catherine. Never that. But to stand alongside her. 2 women who loved this house and this family. 2 chapters in the story of Blackmoor." I turned to him, tears streaming down my face, and saw that he was crying too. We held each other in that tower room, surrounded by unfinished dreams and completed ones, by memories of loss and promises of hope. And I understood, finally and completely, that this was where I belonged. Not because I was required to be here, not because duty or circumstance had brought me to this place, but because love had found me when I least expected it, had lifted me from the ashes of my broken past and given me wings to fly. I was the Duchess of Blackmoor. I was a wife, a mother, a survivor. I was a woman who had learned that the deepest wounds can become the source of the greatest strength, that the coldest hearts can learn to love again, and that every ending is also a beginning. Standing there in the fading afternoon light with my husband's arms around me and the sound of my daughter's laughter drifting up from the garden below, I closed my eyes and let gratitude wash over me like a wave. This was my life. This was my home. This was my love story, improbable and impossible and absolutely perfectly real. And I would not have changed a single moment of it.